Welcome back, folks. In today's episode, we're going to continue on with the reassembly of the Suzuki TS50 clutch basket. We're going to finally mount it on the bike. If you recall in the last episode, I had done some reconditioning of the spare engine's clutch basket because of wear on the original basket's fingers, so we're going to install that assembly. And there are a few other things related to this part of the project that I want to review in a little more detail, so I'm going to switch to an overhead shot to go over those details with you, and then we'll come back to a side shot when I actually begin the reassembly. So let's switch over, and I'll be right back.
All the parts for the clutch assembly laid out here. Up in the upper right are a few new parts, new springs. I think I've talked about getting new springs before, and a new locking washer. Those are still available from Suzuki. These are some of the original parts that I'm going to reuse. A bushing, thrust washer, lifter, nut, etc. So those will be part of the installation as well. Here's the clutch basket that I reconditioned in the previous video. This is off the spare engine. We've talked about that in some detail, so I'm not going to go through that today, or in this video anyway. What I did want to talk about is there's a couple of things. One is these are new clutch plates. These are brand new. You can still get these from Suzuki, by the way. They're a little bit expensive. This engine uses 4 fiber plates, and you can see the part number right there. Suzuki did make an engineering change somewhere along the way, and they changed part numbers, and the plates are very similar. They do fit, but they are not exactly the same, and I'll show you what I mean. Now, this is the original clutch package that came off the TS50 restoration project. You can see it as I had removed it and used some zip ties to hold everything together. So this has not been apart since I took it off the bike and quickly put it back together to maintain the order. One thing you will notice, or at least that I noticed, is if you look closely at the clutch plates right here, there's a difference, a little bit difference in size of the tabs. You can see these first 3 right here, 1, 2, 3, which match the new plates, by the way. The new plates are the same as those first 3 plates. The inner plate is different, and I think that's a newer part number, part of the engineering change I just mentioned from Suzuki. Now, why this clutch would have 3 of one type of plate and 1 of another is a mystery. I do believe someone has been in this clutch before. Perhaps they were having trouble with it and they decided to replace just one of the plates, and either they had their dealer do it, which I doubt, or they did it themselves, went down and bought a new plate, came up with this one, which does fit, but there is a slight mismatch. Does that affect the operation? Maybe. My initial thinking was perhaps that was part of the problem with the poor clutch feel I have alluded to several times. In retrospect, I suspect not. I do not think this difference in plates is probably what's been affecting the clutch. I think more likely the issue with the clutch was the wear on the original clutch basket and those fingers that we've talked about a number of times now. Because what happens is those plates have to move back and forth this way as you pull in on the clutch. Against the pressure of the springs, you move those clutch plates apart, and what will happen is you want there to be distance between the plates, and if those tabs hang up on those fingers and catch, it doesn't allow the clutch to release properly. I think that's probably the most likely cause of the difficulties of the clutch. Now again, it did work, but it just didn't feel right. There's another observation regarding that I want to talk about. Again, this is the inner hub, the original, and you will note right here a little dimple or depression that is factory made. If you look at the factory service information, they're very specific. But that little dimple right there must align with a matching mark right here on the outer cover. I think you can probably see it. I'm pointing to it right there. There's a little round circle right there that has to match up with that dimple when you put this assembly back together. Otherwise, the service manual indicates you will have issues with sticking and poor action in the clutch. Now, were those two aligned when I took the bike apart? Unfortunately, I don't know. I have a lot of photos of this clutch assembly coming apart, but unfortunately, though I have photos of this mark and I can see where it was at initially when I went to take the engine apart, the angle does not allow me to see where this dimple was in relationship to this mark, unfortunately. So I don't know if those two were aligned properly or not when I first took the engine apart. It's possible they weren't aligned because someone has been in this clutch before, as I said, I'm sure of it. But I don't know if those are aligned. And that could have been part of the issue with the poor clutch feel. The other thing that I want to take note of for you is these clutch springs, and this is a very clever design. These springs actually thread into these holes all the way around. They literally thread in like a bolt. And again, the service manual is very specific that the spring, this face of the spring, should not protrude beyond the face of the inner hub. They need to be level or perhaps even a bit recessed, but certainly they are not to protrude. And in fact, in this clutch, I have not adjusted anything. These are the original springs. This spring right here, I don't know if you can see that or not, this spring does protrude. This spring right here protrudes. This spring protrudes. Actually, 4 of them do. This one does also. This one is negative. This one is about level. So there's 4 of the 6 springs that actually protrude beyond the face, contrary to what the service manual indicates should be the case. Now, were they installed that way by Suzuki to begin with? Possibly. Again, I don't know. Were they, through time, they crept in? Probably not, because of the way these are held under tension by those pins. I suspect it was probably installed this way originally, or someone had these apart for some reason, one of the previous owners, and didn't get those quite right. But I'm going to replace all of those springs anyway with new factory springs. So I'll be spinning all these out, and then we will make sure that they're all at least flush, if not just a fuzz negative, in relationship to the face of this inner basket or inner hub. Those are the few things I wanted to share with you. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to go ahead and take this apart and clean this outer plate and the steel plates. They have not been cleaned since I disassembled this and did a cursory cleaning when I took it apart. I'm going to take this apart and clean it really good. Obviously, I'm going to salvage the steels. That's these steel plates. And then I'll start assembling the clutch package using these new fiber plates. And I'm going to thread in these new springs to replace these. So I'll show you a little bit of me threading these springs out and replacing them. There's not a whole lot to it. In fact, I could probably do that with my hand. In fact, I can. As you can see there, I literally can thread that spring out with my fingers like that. So what I will do is I'll pull all of these out, clean those threads out a little bit, and then I'll put the new springs in as replacements. Here's a good up-close look at the original spring on the right and the new spring on the left. They are identical for all practical purposes. A little difference in the bend, but that's irrelevant for this application. Now we're going to go ahead and install these. That's the first spring. The reason I went from the back side rather than trying to thread it in from the front is I think it's just going to be easier that way to start it this way rather than trying to hold the hook of the spring and get it started in like that. I think it's just easier to thread it like that. Flip it over. In this case, I just have a plier, grab a hold of that piece of the spring and just rotate it, rotate the hub. You can try to grab the spring and turn it, but it's down in there quite a ways. Again, you want to be level, if at all possible. That's the preferred condition, is that spring where it protrudes right here should be level with the face of the inner hub. And I'll come back around and check all those after I have all the springs in. Last spring, I found it's easier just to use a good quality needle nose and reach down in there and grab that bend hook in the spring, hold it tight in my right hand and just rotate the hub like that. It takes mere seconds. So all the springs are in, so what I'm going to do is get a straight edge and I'm going to just slide it across here. And I'll do a visual as well as a straight edge to make sure nothing's protruding and none of the springs are going to hang up on that straight edge. Simple little straight edge. I've got a number of these I've accumulated over the years. This one happens to be metric. See right there it says millimeter on the left end. I've got imperial and metric. In fact, I got one that's got both imperial and metric on the same straight edge. But you can just take this and just, I can feel right now that that one is catching. So I'm just going to turn it in just a bit. I'm going to work my way around. This one also. And now I'm just going to do the rest of them. We'll be back in a minute. Okay, I've been all the way around and all 6 springs are level, relatively level to maybe just a fuzz below. I want them as close to level with the inner hub as possible. But certainly none of them protrude, which is the main objective here. So those springs are done. Now we're going to move on to trying to put this whole assembly back.
I've got everything all set up here ready to go in terms of the reassembly of the clutch package. There are a couple things I noticed that I should have shared with you when I was doing the overhead view that I'll share with you right now. One is on the steels, which have been cleaned thoroughly. I don't know if you can see this or not, but this particular steel has been overheated probably. And right, I don't know how well you can see that, but right here is bluing around these edges from heat, pretty much all the way around on the fingers right here, these protrusions. And you can see evidence of overheating on the edge right here, pretty much all the way around. So this particular plate has been overheated. The other 3 don't really exhibit that condition. I think this was the plate that the steel was the one that was closest into the engine. I don't know if someone, an operator, probably a kid, teenager, young teenager, was slipping the clutch when they rode it, and That's what beat up these fingers here on the original basket and overheated the clutch. It's entirely possible if someone's riding that clutch too much and beat it up. The other thing I wanted to mention on these steels is I could, in fact, you can see a little bluing on the edges here too. I don't know if you can see that. This plate has bluing on around the edge from heat. The others do not. What I was going to say a moment ago is that I could not find a specification for thickness of these plates. You can find a specification in the service manual for warpage. These are not warped. They're all straight as a pin. But thickness, couldn't find one. I could find one for the fiber, but not for the steels. And as the surface of these doesn't seem to be particularly worn, I'm going to go ahead and just reuse them as they are. The other parts have all been cleaned, as I alluded to a moment ago. This has been washed out in the parts tank. The steels have been cleaned. Everything's been cleaned. My hands are clean. We've talked about this over and over. Make sure your work area, when you're doing this kind of assembly, everything is absolutely clean. I can't abide working in a dirty, greasy, filthy environment. It just isn't my thing. Everything's ready to go. First thing we're going to do, of course, is put the outer clutch basket on. Now there is a thrust washer right here. I don't know if you can see it or not, that I'm going to obviously just leave in place. I did take it off and clean it and put it back, and then I used just a zip tie right here, put it around the shaft just so that thrust washer didn't come off, and manhandling of things around and moving it. So we'll start by clipping this zip tie and get that off, installing this outer clutch basket, then which includes the bushing, of course, right here. It goes inside. I got to get a little lubrication around here, and we'll go ahead and start putting these clutch plates back together. Let me zoom in for you so that you can get a little bit better shot. I'm just going to use the side cutters here and get that zip tie out of the way, like that. Now this clutch basket, as you slide on, of course, again, make sure that that thrust washer is installed. I'm not going to pre-lubricate much of this. I am going to pre-lube or lube up the bushing. And by the way, that brings up a point. Normally, when I install fiber plates, I would soak them probably 8 hours to overnight, 24 hours. And the oil that I'm going to use in a transmission, whether that's, a 1030 or 30 weight or a regular two-stroke transmission oil, I would soak these. I am not going to soak these plates for the simple reason that I'm not going to be putting that outer side cover on because it's got to be painted. And that's one of those, matte silver gray painted covers on this engine. And I have not gotten around to painting it yet, and it will be some time before I do. It will be months, in fact. So I'm going to be leaving the left side of the engine open. And I didn't want to pre-soak these simply because I didn't want oil dripping down and weeping down and getting down in here and then collecting dust over the next, or debris over the next few months while this engine is still open and exposed. So I'm going to leave these dry. Normally I don't, but in this case I will. I don't think the factory pre-soaked or pre-lubricated these plates anyway when they put these engines together at the factory. I think they just put them together and added the transmission oil later. And in fact, I would bet that these engines are shipped dry. That is no transmission oil at all, and that was probably added at the dealer anyway. So that's a little deviation from my normal practice. That is, I'm not going to pre-lubricate or soak those plates. In terms of the clutch basket itself, there's really no orientation of this that we need to worry about outside of engagement here with the pinion drive that I'm pointing to right here. I'm going to take a little 3-in-1 oil and just lubricate that shaft up. Just a little 3-in-1. You could use transmission oil, you could use motor oil, you can use whatever floats your boat. I'm just using a little 3-in-1 light oil. Put a little 3-in-1 on the outside of the bushing as well. You could use assembly lube here, and in fact I oftentimes do use assembly lube. It really depends on my mood. Little 3-in-1 here. And you can see how easily that engaged with the drive pinion. The outer basket installed, we're going to go ahead now and install the inner hub right here. There is a thrust washer that goes behind this, and then this just line up the splines, pop it on like that. There is no orientation at this point of anything. Now we're going to have to go ahead and install the locking washer and nut. That washer goes like that. New from Suzuki, as well as the original nut that holds this whole assembly together. Thread that on. Like that. So we're going to come back and torque that in a few minutes.
Made a little clutch holding tool, as you can see here. Those are the clutch plates out of the second engine or the spare engine. You have to lock those two hubs together. That is the inner hub I just turned, and then the outer hub. They have to be locked together so I can torque that nut on the end of that shaft. And you can buy tools, commercially made tools. I've never used them. You can also rig up your own, and that's what I did here by taking those original clutch plates that aren't going to be used anyway. They're in pretty poor condition, and I just bolted them together with 3, I think those are 632 standard panhead screws with some nuts on the back. Left the assembly a little loose so I can work the plates in. I've done this before, as you can see here. I got a couple of examples. I think that's the Suzuki TS185 tool that I made, and then I have the Kawasaki H2A triple right there. And I also have made similar tools. I think the Yamaha YL1 I did the same thing on, and the Honda SL125 I think. But anyway, I used all the clutch plates out of the spare engine. Now normally I would only use 2 or 3, something like that, but since these plates, especially the fiber plates in my hand there, are not in very good shape, I'm concerned about how strong they are, and since I'm going to put a fair amount of torque on that nut, I want to make sure I didn't shear anything off. So I just took all the plates, the whole pack, and just put them installed them in the clutch assembly, marked them, drilled them, and use those 3 panhead screws you can see there just to hold the assembly together. And we'll be using that here in just a second to lock that whole clutch hub, inner clutch hub, and the outer clutch basket together when I torque the nut. Moved in for a little bit closer perspective so you can see what I'm going to do. I'm going to now install that clutch locking tool in place. Again, I left those screws and nuts a little loose so I can jockey those pieces around to get them to slide in over the notches in the inner basket and the slots in the outer basket fingers. And that's what you can see me doing there, is just fitting it all together. I want to make sure it completely fits inside of that basket. Then I will come back with a wrench and I will tighten those nuts up a bit and just pull that pack together so that I eliminate any movement within the plates or between the plates. I just used that little wrench there to tighten those 3 nuts up nice and tight. I want to pull that pack together. I don't want any squirming if I can prevent it between the plates. I want everything locked together well. So that's all I used that little wrench for. I didn't have to worry about the heads of the screws spinning on the back side. That did not seem to be an issue. But what we're going to move on here in a second is we're going to talk about locking that pinion to prevent it from turning when I put torque on that big nut in the middle. Because what will happen is I turn that nut, the whole assembly is going to want to rotate. Now you can use a coin, like a penny, a piece of clean fabric, usually cotton or something like that, and put it down that joint I'm pointing to right now where the two gears mesh together. I've used both techniques successfully. I could also put a bar through the connecting rod, as you've seen me do before, but in this case I'm going to use a piece of clean cotton, and I'm just going to wedge it down in between the gear teeth that I'm pointing to right there. You'll see me in a second just rotate that. What that will do, because that's a precision fit between those gears, that will effectively prevent that whole assembly from turning when I put the torque wrench or the torque to the nut in the middle. Very effective way of doing it, and it's easy to get the rag out. You'll see here in a few minutes. I'm going to set the initial torque to 20 foot-pounds. If you recall from my previous video, I talked about going to 36 foot-pounds, even though that's a 60 millimeter and the standard torque is quite a bit higher. Since that's a hollow shaft that the clutch rod moves through, I'm not going to go above 36 foot-pounds. So I normally creep up on my torque. I don't go right to the full torque immediately. Most people don't. I will start at 20, and I will then work up, gradually approaching the 36 foot-pounds. A little difficult to sometimes do this when you're working alone, because things on an engine like this, if it's not in a frame, will want to work and squirm on you. But I didn't have too much trouble with this one. In fact, I think there I just hit the 20 foot-pounds. Now I'll readjust the torque, and I think I went up to, if I recall, 30 foot-pounds, and we'll in a second here torque it up to 30, and then we'll go all the way up to finish it at 36. Again, you can see it wants to work around and squirm when you work alone and it's not in the frame. .30 foot-pounds. Now we're going to work our way up to 36. Resetting the torque wrench there. It's a good quality torque wrench. I have 3 or 4 torque wrenches. That's my favorite. It happens to be a Craftsman. I've had it for quite some time. It's a clicker, obviously. It's not digital. And we're going to work our way up to 36 foot-pounds. And I do the double click at the end just to verify the torque. So I've got everything tightened up there, and you can see I just turned that backwards and that little piece of cotton cloth just popped right out. So now we've got the nut torqued. I have to then position the assembly in such a way as I can decide where I want to bend that locking tab up. I'm pointing to right there up against one of the flats on the nut itself. So what I'm doing is I'm just looking for the best spot to start to bend the tab up. I'll use a big screwdriver here in a second that I'll pad with some duct tape just so I don't mar anything up when I get in there, but I want to find the most convenient spot. There is no really great spot in there because of those springs that kind of get in the way, those clutch springs. You notice there I had pulled the locking tool out and just checking, make sure everything's spinning freely, and it was. I didn't have any trouble with it at all. You see I've got the black duct tape wrapped around the shank of the screwdriver, and that's just to protect everything from damage. And I'm just gently bending up part of that locking tab near the point on the flat on the nut where I want to flatten it up against the nut itself. Can't get in there with a chisel. There's just not room for that, like I did on the pinion. So now I'm going to get a pair of pliers, and I'm going to just squeeze that locking tab up nice and tight. against the flat of the nut to lock it in place. Using either a chisel and a punch like you did on the pinion, or a pliers like this, either way is perfectly fine. I use both techniques depending on the application. The factory probably had a special made tool for that, I would think. And there we have the flat complete, and that part of the assembly is done. Now we're going to install the plates. It really doesn't make any difference which way you orient those plates. They're ambidextrous. So we start with a steel plate and fit it all the way in. Then we'll move on to a fiber or cork. Then we'll do a steel. That's really the outside of the assembly, and now the faceplate will go on. Again, you can see that little dimple at the top of the inner hub. I'm pointing to it right now. That dimple in that hub will have to be aligned with the corresponding mark on the faceplate. There you can see me pointing to it with my finger. Those two marks have to be aligned when you put that faceplate or install that faceplate on the assembly, like that. Now I'm going to use my little hook. Talked about this before, and I'll pull that spring out, and then I'll insert one of the pins. Now the pins I have in that little metal magnetic tray just to keep them organized. It's easy to lose those. They're all cleaned up, of course, and degreased. No oil on them at all. So I just pull that spring out with my right hand on the little hook, and with my left hand insert the pin through the eye of the spring, like you can see there. Remove the tool. Make sure everything's aligned correctly with the pliers. And we've got 5 more to go. Now I'm not going to show all 5 of those because number one, I'm probably going to get in the way of the camera with my body, and it's a little bit redundant. So we're going to move on here and just continue on with the insertion of those.
Now we've got the clutch basket assembly complete. It's all installed. I'm wondering if anyone noticed the mistake I made. It's a pretty significant mistake, actually. And that is I forgot to put the lifter in, or the pusher inside of there, that rod slides through that shaft and lifts this faceplate off to allow those clutch plates to separate. I'd forgotten to install that, and what had happened, it was my mistake, certainly. This little magnetic bowl that I kept the pins in for the springs right here, apparently I had that lifter set out here with all the other parts, and one time when I set this bowl down, I set it down close enough to that lifter, and it got drawn to the bottom edge of this bowl, and I lost visibility to it. I didn't see it, in other words, until after I had completed putting the pins in the first time, and I picked up the bowl to move it, and I found that lifter in that all nuts. So I went ahead off camera, of course. I pulled the pins back out, pulled the faceplate off, put the lifter back in, put everything back together. So that was the mistake that I made. So if anyone noticed that during the course of the video, drop me a note down below. I'd be curious how many people might have picked up on that. But at this point, we're complete with this video. Now, long ways to go on the right side of the engine. As I indicated a moment ago, this is the right side cover for this bike. I'm not going to put this on at this point. This needs to be painted. This is that ubiquitous Japanese motorcycle gray color, matte finish. I will repaint this in the spring. It's still winter here when I'm working on this engine, and I'm not going to be able to paint this. I might in fact powder coat it. I'm not sure. I have powder coated engine cases before. I'm just not sure if the powder that I have matches this, so I might have to do a little test run to figure that out and make it a little coupon. do a test run on the color. But eventually this will be either powder coated or wet coated and then sealed with a matte finish clear, but that'll be much later on. So at this point I'm going to leave this engine open as you see it right here, and I'm probably just going to wrap up. I'm not going to put the top end on it. I'm not going to do any more assembly to this engine at this point until it's mounted in the frame. The reason I do that is I like to keep the engine as light as possible when I go to mount it in a frame, and if you put that cast iron cylinder and you start adding weight to the engine, especially when you work alone like I do, it makes it more difficult, I find, to manhandle the engine. So I will, at this point, I think I'm just going to wrap this in a nice clean towel, put it on the shelf, or put it out of the way. Won't probably be too long before I mount this in the frame. I usually do that fairly early in the restoration process, but we'll have to see a little bit here of the flow of how this works out. But at this point, in the immediate future, I'm done with this engine, and we'll pick it up when we install it in the frame. So that's going to be it for this video today, folks. Any issues, questions, thoughts, drop me a note. Otherwise, as usual, thanks for watching.